conserving blue carbon ecosystems like seagrass, mangroves, and marshlands is important because they store 3 times more carbon than forest and land ecosystems. They also provide jobs and income to local economies, improve water quality, support healthy fisheries, and provide coastal protection. However, it is estimated that half of the global mangrove cover has disappeared in the last 40 years. Did you know Sri Lanka was designated as the global mangrove champion under the Commonwealth Blue Charter? Over the next decade, Dilma Conservation will commit to restore and conserve over 24 acres of degraded mangrove forest in Sri Lanka. We are collaborating with governmental organizations, local communities, educational institutes, and other corporates. We aim to create a replicable model which will restore mangrove and shallow marine ecosystems with socio-economic development by the year 2030. Mangroves are a unique ecosystem, a special ecosystem, and a vulnerable ecosystem. But we can protect the mangroves together.
The ocean. Our island is surrounded by it. We live in the midst of it. Mesmerizing. Enthralling. Pleasing. Our ocean is unique, a vibrant marine habitat. We have loyal whales who never leave our seas. Turtles who always return to our shorelines. Mangroves sequestering carbon. Dugongs gliding beneath the waves. Seagrass meadows pumping oxygen we breathe. Underwater reefs sheltering marine life. But they're struggling. Coral reefs bleached. Our seabeds scraped over by foreign fishing trawlers. We're depleting our marine life through overfishing. Plastic and chemical waste pollution gush into our oceans. Coastal sand is disappearing. Marine animals killed by dynamite. Turtles entangling in goose nets. Ships colliding with whales. Climate change. Global warming. Oil spills. Coastal construction. Ocean acidification. Ocean's life is draining. We need the ocean. Our survival depends on it. The sea around us is now a hotspot for geopolitics, trade, security, maritime ventures, and crime. Our impact on the ocean matters. Our ocean is our lungs, our hearts, our nerves. Without it, no one can survive. We can only thrive if our oceans survive. Let's strive to be the guardians of the ocean. Let us be the protectors, together, for our ocean.
and welcome to the session 2 of the World Oceans Day Summit 2021. I'm Chathu Munasinghe. I'm a researcher attached to the Department of Zoology of University of Perera. World Oceans Day Summit is hosted by the Pearl Protectors in partnership with Marine Environment Protection Authority, also known as MIPA, Blue Resources Trust, and World Ocean Day Organization. World Oceans Day Summit intends to delve into all aspects of the ocean around Sri Lanka while highlighting key challenges, opportunities, and mainly inspiring Sri Lankans to love and care for our marine environment. You can learn more about this summit on pearlprotectors.org site if you wish to. So in this session, we will talk about coral reefs in Sri Lanka under the theme of Sri Lanka's ocean biodiversity. I would like to request all our audience to send us any questions you may have. We will try to answer the most relevant questions by the end of this session. You can simply add your questions to the comment section on either Facebook or YouTube. The topic of this session is coral reefs in Sri Lanka. And let me give a brief introduction about the coral reefs. If you take the distribution of coral reefs in the world, most coral reefs occur between the tropics of Cancer and Capricorn. As a tropical country, we are blessed to have beautiful coral reefs around our island. It is very interesting and important as coral reefs are among the most biologically diverse and productive ecosystems on the planet. They also provide coastal protection from erosion and storms. Meantime, they play a vital role in our economy and culture for fisheries. Coral reefs also provide livelihoods, food security, and touristic value to the country. Our fisheries and coral reefs are closely associated with seagrass meadows and mangroves, where they are functioning as linked ecosystems. However, coral reefs also function on their own without other associated ecosystems. So, without further ado, I'll introduce you the two great panelists that we have here today to talk about this topic. Mr. Arjan Rajasuriya is the marine and coastal expert at the IUCN Sri Lanka Country Office. Previously, he was employed as a research officer at the National Aquatic Resources Research and Development Agency, also known as NARA, and was in charge of the Coral Reef Research Program from 1988 to 2012. And we also have here today Mr. Nishan Perera, a marine biologist with an interest in reef fish ecology and MPA management. He is the co-founder of Blue Resources Trust and currently the lead researcher in the Blue Resources Trust Coral Reef Program. He has previously worked with IUCN, Sustainable Partnership, and Project Seahorse. So, to get a head start on this topic, I'd like to ask Arjan about the locations where the major reefs are found in Sri Lanka.
Thank you. Thank you, Chatrika. We have this map on the screen now, which shows the orange areas that have the major coral reefs in Sri Lanka. Most of them are fringing reefs. So if you take from the north, we have Point Pedro, going up to Mandathivu, around all the islands. And then in the Pork Bay, we have a section. Then the largest corals are between Mana and Kandakulia, including the Bar Reef. Then we also have off Colombo, fairly offshore reefs at a depth of about 20 meters. Then in the south, we have from Hikkadua, stretching all the way up to Tangol. On the east coast, we have coral reefs from Kuchaveli right down to Kalmuni. So these are the major coral beds around Sri Lanka.
Okay, having talked a little bit about the distribution of coral reefs Sri Lanka, let me ask Nishan about the different types of reefs that we can find in these locations.
Yeah, hi Chatrika, and good morning or almost afternoon to everyone. Yeah, There are three actually main types of reef formations in Sri Lanka, based on kind of their geological structures. What Arjan mentioned are what we think of, traditionally as coral reefs, what we call true coral reefs. So those are basically corals built on limestone structures, similar to that. So what you see on the top is the live coral, but actually they're built on many generations of past corals. Dead corals become limestone rock. So it's built up from coral skeletons, and they're true coral reefs. And these occur, as Arjan mentioned, fringing reefs and some patch reefs further offshore, like places like Colombo and Negombo. What he showed on the map is that you don't have a very extensive distribution of these coral reefs. They're mostly fairly shallow waters, except for a few. But what we have in Sri Lanka, also more widely distributed, are two other forms of reef. Sandstone reefs. This picture is of Colombo. This is very common around Sri Lanka. These are remnants of former coastlines, and they occur as kind of ridges parallel to the coastline of Sri Lanka, and they're found all around Sri Lanka. They're quite extensive, probably the most extensive form of reef. And we also have these rocky reefs, which are mostly like rock boulders. They're more common in the southwestern coast, but you get a few in other areas. They are usually aggregations of rock boulders and pinnacles. And these are not formed out of coral, obviously rock, granite, and sandstone, but they have things like corals growing on them. And they're still very important in terms of habitat for all the reef-associated species, for biodiversity, and also for fisheries. So these are the main habitats. So when we think of coral reefs, we think of the traditional reefs, but also these other habitats are quite important.
Yeah, we know that coral reefs are generally highly biodiversity areas. So what are the species associated with these coral reefs in Sri Lanka, Arjan?
We have different types of organisms associated with them. If I take the corals, for example, the reef building corals, as we know, the coral reefs, there are 209 different varieties, or what we call species. In addition to that, we have a lot of soft corals. Then we have various other organisms associated with them, such as lobsters, starfish, then gorgonians or sea fans. And there are other fish, for example, the fish life itself. There isn't a accurate count on the number of species that's found on coral reefs in Sri Lanka. But we have a record of at least 500 different varieties or species associated with them. And there have been statements to say that there are maybe more than 1,000 species associated with them. So these are the major groups that you will find on coral reefs and associated with them. So there are other species that are associated with coral reefs. So sometimes they visit coral reefs, sometimes they move out, including different species of sharks and big rays.
Okay, just a quick follow-up question about the biodiversity, Arjan. If we only consider corals, what is the status of our coral diversity and abundance compared to other places around the world?
Well, this is a question where you need to compare different reefs when you say other parts of the world. So we are basically a continental, we have continental type reefs, in the sense that it is also affected the number of ways from land-based activities, as well as through rivers, sedimentation, for example. And now if you take Maldives, our closest neighbor that have a lot of coral reefs, they do not have this sedimentation and fresh water coming. So if we compare these two, you will find that Sri Lanka has less diversity and more turbidity in the water, and corals that survive in those turbid conditions do better here than in the Maldives. But Maldives has a much more diversity and also always blue water. So comparing them has a little bit of a problem because of these differences that I mentioned. But in terms of comparison of continental reefs, you find that ours is generally of a high diversity because we have 209 species of corals. But however, they have also been degraded due to various reasons that we would discuss later.
Yeah. And also, coral reefs are one of the ecosystems that indicate climate change effects very clearly. I'd like to know from Arjan, does this climate change affect coral reefs? Has coral reefs in Sri Lanka experienced major impacts from climate change?
Yes. The first large-scale impact that we saw was in 1998, where the Indian Ocean experienced a lot of coral bleaching, what we call coral bleaching. When corals are under stress, they do lose color. And then you see the underlying skeleton, and then you have this white coral. But at that stage, they are not dead yet. But if the conditions do not improve, then over a few days or a few weeks, they will eventually die. So Sri Lanka has had this large-scale impact, and a lot of our coral reefs died as a result. We also saw good regeneration in certain parts. Now, for example, the Bar Reef recovered in about 10 years to a good extent. But however, we must remember that reefs that did recover were the ones that were away from human impact. Now, in the south coast, actually, they did not recover very well, and some recovered partially, but also they continue to get affected by various human impacts. So they are in a very degraded state even now.
Yeah. Nishan, could you please explain? Now, Arjun mentioned about the coral bleaching problem that we had in 1998. Could you please explain the overall impact to coral reefs in Sri Lanka from the most recent ENSO effect experienced?
The most recent major coral bleaching events. So these are the bleaching impacts in Sri Lanka are often tied to global bleaching events. We are not in isolation. So 98 was a big global event, and the most recent global event was around 2016. And Sri Lanka was again affected by this. So Arjun mentioned how the Bar Reef recovered very well from the 98 event, but unfortunately the Bar Reef was again impacted very badly by the 2016 event. And one of those pictures you saw earlier is of the Bar Reef after that event, where most of the corals have now died. So a lot of those a lot of the reefs that recovered were seriously impacted by this event. And usually because of the oceanographic conditions, the way the currents move at that time of the year, the bleaching tends to happen mostly around May, late April to May. The reefs on the west coast tend to get impacted a lot more than the reefs on the east coast. It's because of the oceanographic conditions. So again, those reefs, whatever was recovering, was impacted very badly, and they are also now again in a very poor state again. However, there was also another smaller bleaching event in 2019. Now, this wasn't a big global event, and the geographic scale of it was less. However, in areas of the East Coast like Pasikuda and Kayankani, the impact was quite intense in Sri Lanka. And unfortunately, some of those reefs which had escaped the previous bleaching events or survived those were very badly affected and have lost about 90% or more of the live corals. So we've had significant impact. And the biggest threat or challenge is that global bleaching events are becoming more frequent with climate change. So the time available for reefs to recover is going to be reduced. And this is going to impact, because earlier bleaching is not a new phenomenon. It has happened historically, but there was time for reefs to recover. The challenge is whether the reefs will have that time to recover now.
So that means like we will be experiencing more frequent bleaching events in the future?
Based on the predictions of climate scientists and oceanographers, that is the expected kind of scenario.
Okay. So, all right. So those are basically the impacts from climate change to coral reefs. Other than climate change, what are the other major threats that Sri Lankan coral reefs face right now, Arjun?
There are multitude impacts from human activities. The major impact comes from fishing, actually, because we are using a lot of the fishing gear close to the coral reefs or directly on coral reefs, catch different species, including lobsters, reef fish. So this is a very destructive thing. Then we also have pollution. For example, if you take the coast of Colombo, it's one of the most polluted areas around the country, because there are lots of canals, then there are two sewer outfalls, then there is the Bere Lake and the rivers that also bring in pollution. So pollution is another major impact, as well as physical damage caused by such as what you see on the screen, like boat anchors, and also people trampling the reefs, especially in places like Hikkadua and Unawatuna. And then you also have coastal development that can alter longshore currents and deposit activities. So these are the major things. And of course, in the future, we may also have other large-scale pollution if we are going in for hydrocarbon exploration and various other forms of activities, human activities.
Okay, when we talk about the health of a reef, some fish like parrotfish and parrotfish are considered as fishes that shape the coral reefs. What is the scientific explanation behind this, Nishan?
Well, parrotfish and surgeonfish and things like rabbitfish are herbivores, so they graze on algae, and they play a very important role in controlling the algae levels on a reef. So coral reefs actually are, in a way, algal reefs because algae grows on everything underwater. The reason we don't see so much algae on a healthy coral reef is because these herbivores are constantly grazing on it. So what we call a high cropping rate on these things. But if you don't have them, the algae is basically going to grow uncontrolled. And algae causes two problems. One is they can compete with living corals and potentially smother corals and compete for space. Also, in areas where reefs are dead, like after a bleaching event, heavy algae cover can prevent new coral larvae from settling, so reduce the chance of recruitment. So therefore, like herbivores play this important role of grazing, creating habitat for corals to grow on, and helping corals to thrive. So removing herbivores, for example, can cause an imbalance in the ecosystem. So they play this important ecosystem role. Parrotfish also play another role in that they grind down limestone coral rock when they feed on the algae, which then basically they excrete in a powder format or sand. So parrotfish are actually major contributors to creating a coralline sand around coral reefs. So these are some of the ecological roles that they play.
Yeah. So, okay, so parrotfishes contribute to the reefs, but when we visit a market, we see parrotfish and other herbivores often fished and displayed to sell. So what is your opinion on this, Arjan? Do we need to ban them, or is it in a manageable level?
There's a lot of overfishing around our water, so it's certainly not at a manageable level. I wouldn't say that it's at a manageable level, but banning them is also not the answer, because then lots of livelihood depends on fishing on our coral reefs and also in the coastal waters. But there has to be good management. Unfortunately, we do not have good management. There is no good monitoring program from the fishing aspect of it. So you find even these ecologically important species that Nishan mentioned earlier that actually maintain the health of the coral reefs being overfished. But this is a very big struggle for Sri Lanka to actually get a handle and try to control the fishing so that our reefs have a healthy system for the corals to grow and also for all these species to breed. So this overfishing is one of the major issues that I can bring out here.
Also, Arjun, we discussed about some of the threats to reefs in Sri Lanka. There are some direct threats such as fishing directly on the reefs. Apart from them, there is collection of export-oriented species like lobsters, shanks, and ornamental fish trade. So what is the level of protection given by legislation to protect coral reefs in Sri Lanka from such kind of things?
The two main acts that protect the coral reefs is the Fauna and Flora Protection Ordinance of the Department of Wildlife Conservation and the Fisheries Act. Both acts list species that should not be harvested or protected. However, due to lack of monitoring, these species get collected and harvested. And sometimes destructive fishing methods may destroy them as well, even if they are not brought ashore. For example, dynamite fishing, which is also present in certain areas in Sri Lanka, especially the offshore reefs in the Gulf of Mannar, like Wankali, and also on the east coast around Pigeon Islands, in the offshore areas of Pigeon Island. So these are problems that can actually degrade reefs and continue to degrade. And further, there is also collection of other species, especially aquarium trade, and also harvesting sea cucumber, shanks. It's a form of mollusk, and also spiny lobsters. Now, for example, to collect the lobsters, there's diving, and also nets are laid on reefs, bottom set nets. So these are breaking all the corals on the reefs when the net is pulled out. So these are some of the major impacts.
Yeah,
And
having this.
the legislation actually, although some legislation is there, it doesn't really protect them or look after the reefs due to lack of monitoring.
Yeah, having discussed about the level of protection given by legislation, Nishan, I'd like to know how many coral reef marine protected areas are there in Sri Lanka and where are they?
So there are a few MPAs or marine protected areas that are very focused on coral reefs. I mean, Sri Lanka's first marine protected areas was the Hikkaduwa. Now it's currently designated as a national park. It started at a lower level of designation. So Hikkaduwa was built around coral reefs. We have the Pigeon Island National Park, Rumasala Sanctuary, Bar Reef Marine Sanctuary, which is one of the main or large marine protected areas in Sri Lanka. And in recently, they declared Kayankani Reef as a marine protected area, marine sanctuary. So these are MPAs that are focused around coral reefs, where coral reefs are the primary ecosystem. The Bar Reef, however, does have other significant areas of other associated ecosystems, which is very important because coral reefs are not always in isolation. Sometimes they're connected to other ecosystems like seagrasses and mangroves and other coastal wetlands. So the Bar Reef is quite interesting in its original design. It has encompassed a lot of those habitats. I think Arjan at his time at NARA at that time was quite involved in kind of the design aspects of it. Unfortunately, of course, just like the legislation, the challenge is actual management. Most of these parks are struggling because we are not having the enforcement of the MPA regulations. That is where a lot of the challenges are. If you look at the legislation, whether it's for species or MPAs, we have them, but we have challenges with enforcement or implementation, and that's something we need to look at innovative solutions for.
Yeah, I assume that is one of the major problems, like problem of implementation that we face in the inland national parks also. So as you mentioned, Hikkadu is one of the marine national parks. In fact, like you mentioned, it is the first marine national park declared, and also one of the most famous reefs in Sri Lanka. Arjun, could you give us a sense about what is actually happening there? Is there a problem of siltation in Hikkadu? Is it dying now?
Yes, as you correctly say, the reef is in a very poor state. Hikkadu was one of the most nicest coral patches close to the shore in the past, but it had a lot of impacts from human activities, including anchoring of boats and pollution and so on. So, to solve some of these problems, the boats were shifted into the fisheries harbor, which is just adjacent to the marine sanctuary. And the building of the breakwaters seems to have had a very negative impact on the coral reef itself because it affected the longshore current and as a result trapped all the sand and sediment inside the sanctuary or the national park now. So today, if you go there, areas that were about 2 meters deep is only about 1 meter deep. And most of the reef is buried. And of course, it was affected in the 1998 bleaching and subsequent bleaching, and also its recovery is highly affected due to the sedimentation. So you're right, Chatrika. It is the sedimentation is one of the major impacts right now, and as a result, the beach also has widened because all that sand and sediment has now accumulated on the beach, and as well as covering most of the reef, especially on the seaside of the reef, the beyond the wave zone. All those grottos and deep holes are now entirely filled by sand. So that's a sad story. Yes, true.
And Nishan, what do you think about the attractiveness of the Hikadu Reef today for tourism?
Well, I haven't seen it probably as far back as people like Arjan, but I was fortunate to see this reef in the 1990s prior to the 98 bleaching event. So I would just say that none of the reefs in the south coast even look close to what they used to look like. Now, reefs on the east coast, for example, have degraded, but you still have these patches of healthy reef. But there is nothing along the south coast that even comes close to resembling what those reefs look like. As we heard before, the reef lagoon is much shallower. Parts of the reef are buried. So the potential for it to recover is seriously compromised because you've lost basically the reef. It's not that the corals are just dead, in which case if we manage some of the other direct human impacts, maybe we can expect some coral larvae to settle and the reef to recover. But when you have a problem like sedimentation and the reef is buried, you're not going to see that recovery. So the coral cover is gone. I mean, as personally set aside my scientific aspect, but as a diver or snorkeler, it's not what it used to be. If you've snorkeled there before, it's not an enjoyable experience to go there. It's actually quite a sad experience to go to these reefs again.
So, okay, that is about the most, like, some of the most beautiful and famous reefs, or what we already have. But very recently, we saw on media that a new reef was discovered near Trinco. Nishan, is it really a newly discovered reef? And if so, what kept this long for this reef to be undiscovered? And do you think there are more reefs like this around the country?
So this reef in particular that they're talking about, they haven't disclosed what the reef is. So I can't speak specifically of a reef when I don't know what the reef is. However, what I would put as a disclaimer here is that it's very unlikely that there are any unknown or undiscovered reefs in Sri Lanka. This is a country with very high population density, heavy fishing, so people access the coastal areas. So particularly shallow coastal areas, nearshore areas are very well known. Even if a researcher doesn't know it, fishermen know it. We often find reefs through fishermen. So they are aware. So it is not necessarily, it's very unlikely that a reef is undiscovered or unknown. Now, there may be reefs that are not so well known to the public or unknown to the wider public, or sometimes even to researchers. It is possible. It's unlikely, but it is possible. So we have to look at it in that context. Maybe it is a reef that is not very well known. Again, I don't know the exact reef. And also, I think there was some discussion of this being kind of a pristine, untouched reef. And again, I would say there are no untouched reefs in Sri Lanka, considering all these challenges and pressures we've discussed. So you may find reefs that look intact in coral cover. So you will find very healthy corals growing on it and some of the reef species like butterfly fish and parrotfish swimming on it. But you will still notice some of the larger fishes, the higher trophic groups, the bigger fish up the food chain, like the big groupers, snappers, reef sharks, they're missing on all our reefs. There's no reef in Sri Lanka where you have these large predators, in large numbers, as you would see on healthy reefs around the world or in Sri Lanka in the past. So that is because of heavy fishing pressure. We have selectively removed a lot of those animals. So there's no reef that's untouched, and also things like sedimentation, pollution, water quality issues are impacting all the reefs. But you do get reefs that have intact corals and healthy corals and are relatively less known and less disturbed than others. But I wouldn't go so far as to say that a reef in Sri Lanka is totally unknown and undisturbed.
Yeah, you mentioned about the large predators on a healthy reef. What are some of the examples of these large predators?
So on Sri Lankan reefs, there would mostly be large groupers, some of the large snappers. Sharks, I don't think historically were a very big part of Sri Lankan reefs. Now, there are on oceanic reefs like the Maldives, on the atolls, you do have a lot more sharks and stuff. Sri Lankan reefs, I don't think had sharks in that number. I mean, and I have not seen large numbers of sharks on any reefs in Sri Lanka, of course, taking into consideration that I have only been in the water for about 25 years. So it's still a relatively short time. But even then, we have definitely seen places where we used to see sharks, like the Bar Reef Sanctuary, for example. I remember in the 90s, reef sharks were very common. You don't see them anymore. In other parts where we did see them, in some numbers, we don't see them. So they have also been definitely impacted. There's definitely overfishing. But more common predators like large groupers, big snappers, these potato groupers, giant groupers, they have completely disappeared. Places like the Great Barsas used to have large potato groupers. They're very rare now, whereas earlier you would get into the water and you'd see 5, 6 of them on a dive. It was common.
Yeah. Arjun, you are someone who has years of experience in researching about coral reefs in Sri Lanka, and I believe you are someone who has been lucky to see the real beauty, the beauty that Nishan has also talked about, beauty, the vibrant colors of corals and reef fishes that lived in our reefs for about like 30, 35 years ago. I'm pretty sure that, like Nishan also mentioned, like what we see today is nowhere close to that beauty. Could you please briefly explain the current status of Sri Lankan reefs?
Yes, as we discussed before, most of them are unfortunately degraded. So what I can say is that yes, I have been lucky to see them in the 60s, from the 60s onwards, and I have also been unlucky to see the destruction of these reefs. So that's where we are today. And also for economic prosperity in the country, for tourism and all of that, reefs are very important for fishing, for sustenance of the population, and also for protein and for tourism. It's very important. So we need to get our act together, and reefs do recover if we do the right thing. So that's what I can say. It's quite degraded. Most of those reefs are quite degraded due to multiple impacts, including the climate change.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that it is kind of a sad situation for you to see this degraded reef for like someone who has seen the real beauty of these reefs for like about 30, 35 years, that we don't see that real beauty of the coral reefs. I would like to turn to you and ask your opinion about this too, Nishan. What do you think about the status of the coral reefs of Sri Lanka compared to what you have seen, like you said, like about 20, 25 years ago?
Sorry, Chatrika, I think someone's connection is breaking. I don't know if it's mine or yours, but we'll try to continue as best as possible. Yeah, I think I got your question about my experience of what I've seen in change. Very similar to Arjun's, and while I haven't been diving for as long as he has, I think what's noticeable is that the rate of degradation in the last 20 to 25 years, particularly post 1998, has been exponentially greater than the rate of degradation before. Reefs have been degrading throughout the world, as human populations increase and human pressures increase. It's understandable. But what we've seen in the last 20 or so years is very rapid degradation. So human pressures have kind of increased very fast in Sri Lanka. Parts of Sri Lanka that were not so accessible for fishing opened up with the end of the war. Of course, the end of the war is a great thing. It's a good thing. But unfortunately, it opened up areas for uncontrolled fishing and overfishing. So the Bar Reef, for example, recovered well after the 1998 bleaching event. However, at that time, that reef was not subject to heavy fishing, which it is now. So that's a problem. Parts of the East Coast that are heavily fished now. So these pressures are increasing. Our land use management and agricultural practices are increasing, sedimentation and pollution, and also this recurring global climate change events and things like coral bleaching that have started hitting our reefs. Because 98, we saw this rapid loss of corals over, a few weeks. We lost in some reefs more than 90% of the living coral, sometimes about 99% in some reefs. So that's been very, very significant and very noticeable rather than gradual change happening over time. I was very lucky, I think, the last generation to see these reefs before the 98 bleaching event. And the other thing you'll notice is that even on these rocky and sandstone reefs, which are not subject to the same level of physical stress. So, things like anchor damage or physical damage is less because it's rocky structures with a few corals. And most of those corals are kind of encrusting types that are more robust and more resilient to stressors. What you will notice is a massive reduction in fish numbers. Those reefs were not vibrant with corals, but they were very, very vibrant with fish life. There were vast numbers of fish. But now they're just rock formations without that life, or the fish have been taken out because of the overfishing. So these are very noticeable changes to our reefs.
Yeah, thank you, Nishan. Yeah, so I also would like to remind our audience
Internet connection, I think. I think we've lost connection. I think we've lost a connection with Chatrika, unfortunately, and hopefully she'll be back. I think Mudita wants us to continue that discussion with the reefs. I think one of the challenges, more than the challenge, I think it's what's important is a point that Arjan's mentioned earlier about the ability of reefs to recover. I think that's something that is often lost in discussion because we are all quite connected to these ecosystems, and we are saddened to see them kind of being degraded, and we see a lot of negativity about it. I mean, even today we are talking about the challenges, which is rightfully so, that these ecosystems are degraded. But I think we shouldn't totally lose hope that they cannot recover. Of course, it's a huge challenge because it will require a lot of good management of these human stressors. But the ability of reefs to recover, I think, was really well demonstrated, for example, after the 98 bleaching event, when places like the Bar Reef actually recovered very well and the corals came back. And we've seen that in other places. I know in the East Coast, some of the reefs that died in 2019 are already showing signs of recovery with new corals growing. So there is that opportunity for reefs to recover, but we need to manage some of the human impacts that affect it. And that's important to increase the resilience of reefs to everything, because even things like climate change that we cannot directly control, we can increase the ability of a reef to withstand these stressors and recover from them by reducing the other pressures. I mean, these days there is concern amongst people, even with this express pearl sinking, about impacts to coral reefs and other marine ecosystems. And again, I think what is important is that ecosystems will eventually recover. They will have impacts, but they will recover. But we need to manage these other chronic problems like pollution and sedimentation and other things. Would you agree, Arjan?
Yes, Nishan. The other aspect that we need to also bring in here is the participation of fishermen and local people in the management of coral reefs. Now, this is something that we do not see in Sri Lanka. It's very important that we have co-management, or what we call co-management, because we are bringing in the local people who are actually using these reefs for fishing, tourism, and other activities. So with their participation, there is a great chance to improve them. Because if you look around, as you correctly mentioned some time back in this discussion, that management is weak and we do not have the strength actually to manage these marine protected areas. So if we can bring in the local people, it also reduces the pressure on the government itself to actually put in money and officers and other equipment to manage it. So this is a very important aspect, I think, that we should bring in. We have to bring in the local communities into the management decision-making process, what we say as a co-management process. So that's lacking in Sri Lanka actually.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think where we've missed is that we do have this kind of conceptually community-based or co-management. I know we've had various projects and looking at these things, but it is, I feel it is more token involvement of communities at various meetings, but they're not actively engaged because we go in with a preconceived idea of what we want to do. And most importantly, I think communities have a big role to play in implementation, both in surveillance and monitoring and enforcement, because we are always talking about, like you mentioned, the lack of resources to be patrolling and monitoring, but we have eyes on the water every day with the local communities, and you work with those communities to increase your surveillance and monitoring and compliance mechanisms and develop enforcement mechanisms where you have joint patrolling and enforcement. And this is not a new concept. It's a concept that, as we are aware, has successfully worked in other developing countries. I think it's very important that Sri Lanka looks at such models, because we can't apply conservation strategies of the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park in Australia because it's a different socio-cultural context and different resources. But countries like Indonesia, Philippines, Tanzania, Kenya, which are developing countries that have similar challenges of heavy resource dependence and low resources or facilities to enforce, they work with communities to monitor their reefs, to enforce regulations. Unfortunately, we see that concept just being taken out of the community, so they have no ownership and they're dependent on a structure that continues to fail them because of various reasons. The structure is also challenged. It's not just to point fingers at government departments. They are also challenged in many ways. But we need to then find innovative solutions with communities to do that, rather than saying this doesn't work and then expect that same system to deliver different results the next time.
Right. Thank you, Mr. Nishan. I'm joining in right now because I believe we have a bit of a connection issue with Chatrika's connection. So she is joining in right now. I hope her connection is right now fine. So let me add Chatrika in. Chatrika, how is your connection right now? Is it all good?
I guess it's okay.
Okay, great.
Okay, so we were talking about the involvements and attitudes of the local community and how they can also contribute. I mean, how they can also work with researchers and so on. So during this discussion, we also discussed about some of the threats that our coral reefs are facing. So when we talk about the coral reefs and the threats to them, we all know about the unfortunate ship accident we are experiencing right now. I believe it is one of the major environmental disasters that our country had to face. So I thought of asking you two about the impacts from this
accidents, like specifically to coral reefs. Arjun, are there like reefs within the area affected by the Express Pearl disaster? If there are, what could be the possible impacts on corals and reefs due to this unfortunate accident?
There are corals on reef systems in that area, but you do not get reefs like the bar reef in that immediate vicinity. But there are reefs that are around 15 to 20 meters deep, and certainly those corals can be affected. But right now, because of the monsoon conditions, it is difficult to see them, and also we do not know what the conditions would be after some time. So data is being collected by the national institutes at the moment, water quality, sediment samples, bottom organisms, and so on. So all I can say at this stage is that we cannot definitively say that this would be the particular impact. But however, corals and all other organisms do go under stress when there is pollution in the water. So some would certainly be affected negatively or very badly, and they may perish. But some might recover. So that is all that I can say at this particular stage, because we do not know what the impacts are. And because of the sea conditions in the southwest monsoon, it's also difficult to actually go and see what the immediate impacts were on the seabed. But remember that we do not have coral reefs here similar to the shallow water coral reefs that we have been showing pictures and also discussing, like the Bar Reef, the Pigeon Islands, the Hikkadua, and so on. These are all offshore reefs and generally around 50 to 20 meters depth.
Nishan, do you also want to add something about the impacts to coral reefs from this ship accident?
Not much. I think Arjun summed it up. I think it's very important in moments like this when we can be quite emotional with these things, that as a scientist, I think we have to be very careful with how we, with our statements as well, because there's definitely obviously going to be negative impacts with any kind of pollution event, but the exact extent is truly unknown. We don't have enough data, and without data, it's you have to be very careful with what you're kind of projecting. It's very important because we may not accurately know. It may be quite bad. It may not be as bad as people are saying or expecting. So there is this situation. I'm not downplaying the incident by any means, but you do have to be data driven, and as Arjun mentioned, there are some attempts to gather data. It is constrained by the monsoon, and sometimes it takes some time for us to understand the exact impact. But I will insist that it's data driven and that ecosystems are more resilient than we think. So while we may lose some species or habitats, some organisms in an area, there is an ability to recover, and it's critical that we have good long-term management so that these ecosystems recover. Because whether it's a human-made accident like this oil spill or a thing like a coral bleaching event, which is more natural, we will have sporadic events that cause pollution or mortality. But how that ecosystem recovers is very dependent on how we manage ecosystems in the long term. So we should not forget that in this moment.
Okay. And probably I think this might be something that our viewers might want to know too. Nishan, if you could explain us how best could we be able to help the coral reefs right now and in the long term to recover from the recent damages from ship accident as well as other climate related damages?
I mean, directly what we need is a shift in our management paradigm and changes with how we do management. But that is more at a policy and government and institutional level. And of course, working with local communities who are directly dependent on resources. As general public, I think we can support conservation initiatives, whether, things like cleanups and activity and lobbying. I mean, sometimes a collective public voice is useful. You will find that for marine conservation, as much as we do see an increase in the voice, the public voice about it, but for many decades, it was essentially a very silent thing. Whereas, while we have our challenges with things like elephant conservation, it does make the news a lot more. There's a lot more noise about it. Marine conservation is relatively young in that aspect in the public attention. As more people, experience the marine environment through boating and diving and snorkeling, as more people become aware, I think there will be an increase in that collective voice. And also, on a small scale, we are all responsible as consumers, because we often talk about overfishing and all of that. We tend to blame the fishermen who are catching a particular species and overfishing it, but they're fishing it for others to consume. A personal experience that I can relate is when I have friends who will go diving with me and complain about the lack of lobsters on reefs now because they're overfished, but yet do not hesitate to order the grilled lobster platter at the restaurant after your diving experience. So, I mean, you can't blame the fishermen for destroying the reef when they are catching the lobster for you to eat. So we have a relationship with this, and it's quite hypocritical if we are consuming that. Do we ask where our fish or seafood is coming from? Are they coming from dynamited sources? Are we consuming less of some of these species? Now, I mentioned that things like groupers are overfished and all of that, but do we want to order a grouper every time we go to a restaurant? Do we want to have shark fin soup? So these are little things. You may not make a big impact with one small change, but these are little ways that you can make a difference that I can think of. Of course, it has to be backed up by government action, policy change, working with improved management as well in the end.
Yeah. With that, I'd like to take up some questions from the audience. I can see some interesting questions in the comment box right now, and some comments about like appreciating the work of pearl protectors and about this about this summit. And one question is, do we have any plans or expectations to have no fishing zone similar to hotspots to encourage recovery of corals and other marine fauna? I think I can direct these questions to Arjan.
Marine protected areas are primarily the vehicle that you can use for these things. But having a marine protected area itself does not ensure the protection of any of these species, or even having a no fishing zone is very difficult in Sri Lanka. Because as we discussed before, every inch of this coastline is fished. So having a no fishing zone means people have to then go to another location, which is probably then going to get an added pressure, double the pressure that it had before. So all these are difficult things to do. However, having marine protected areas and protecting them the way that we discussed before, having the local people involved so that they know how to do things, how not to destroy the reefs, and what they should do when they are fishing, all of that is very important. So co-management, having people on board is the way forward, while having the marine protected areas as the main vehicle that we can take this forward. So if we are successful in getting all that on board, then certainly we can make a difference.
Yeah, I'll turn to you, Nishan, for this question. So has this pandemic been helping at least a little bit for our coral reefs to recover and thrive? What do you think about it?
Potentially yes, and potentially no. It's a loaded question. Definitely, in sites that are impacted by tourism or heavy visitation, definitely it can be a benefit. Less anchor damage, less damage from divers. But also things like tourism can be positive sometimes because you have less things like dynamite fishing or illegal fishing activities happening when there are more people in there. When no one visits an area, they're more exposed to kind of illegal activities. It's like in Yala Block 1, you have less poaching than Block 4 and 5. So there are challenges, and we have temporary halts sometimes. The fishing pressure declines temporarily, but the issue is it's not long enough of a window to allow these things to recover. You need to closures of longer periods, minimum of a year, depending on the life history of the species at risk, then longer periods. So we're not having that. And what would happen in these situations, potentially, being hypothetical now, is that when people lose income, they're going to come back with a redoubled effort to recover and pay back loans. And because people have economic problems, the fishing communities have their own challenges. So they're going to come back with a vengeance to really catch. They get more desperate, so people will come back. So we need longer closures. But in some small areas, yes, of course, it could be beneficial. A place like Hikkaduwa, where there isn't a lot of fishing on any fishing in the national park, and it's mostly tourism that's a problem. Other than sedimentation and stuff, the visitor pressure is less, so things like that's good in places like Pigeon Island. But overall, we need longer periods for things to recover.
Yeah, and I'd like to ask this question from you as well, Nishan. Has this pandemic, like we talked about the pandemic, the next question, we saw some coral restoration attempts backed by the government agencies as well as private sectors. What is your idea on these projects?
Coral restoration can be useful, but in certain situations and applications. The challenge with coral restorations is its scalability. It's very high cost, very labor intensive, and it's not scalable to very large areas. Natural reefs are very big. Even Sri Lanka, which has smallish reefs, we are talking kilometers of reef. And our ability to restore such areas is not there anywhere in the world. And the ability to recover reefs with the functional diversity. We just see certain species of corals that we're able to transplant. Not all corals do well with transplanting. So we cannot recreate these natural ecosystems with that same kind of ecosystem structure and diversity and all of that, and it costs a lot. And as we've discussed before, reefs do have the ability to recover naturally. If you look at reefs that recovered naturally, they've recovered much faster than any reef that has been restored. So therefore, what is more important is prevention and managing these threats and protecting the reefs more than for restoration. However, saying that in certain areas where, for example, the substrate is destroyed and there's no hard substrate for corals to recruit, it could be useful. In sporadic locations where there has been construction, now in the Maldives, they do this where they create boat channels or harbors and they damage areas for development. They relocate corals or they restore small areas. So it can be a useful tool. Or if there is a species of coral that is going extinct in an area, to recover a population of an individual coral species may be kind of actions like restorations to recover populations as gene banks might be useful. But those are applications. But you have to be careful how you use it. You need to understand the problem you're trying to solve and look at its applicability. But I would say it's not a blanket solution to the problem. We can't garden our reefs back. And we have to be careful with what. I'm not saying an absolute no. There may be application situations, but we have to be careful with where we apply that.
Yeah, I'm just being conscious about the time. We can have just one more question. I'd like to direct this question to you, Arjan, for a quick answer. Okay, so we have time for just one more question. I'd like to direct this question to Arjan. Marine aquarium trade and corals are very closely linked, and some people may like to have a marine aquarium at home. As scientists and researchers, what is your message to marine aquarium interested people?
Well, marine aquariums are quite complicated, unlike freshwater aquariums. So people have to understand, who wants to grow corals or even keep reef fish in an aquarium, that it requires constant attention. And assuming that you have all that knowledge and the equipment and so on, it's a nice hobby. But at the same time, it has its you have to be very careful of what you do, because sometimes you can promote things that can get out of control. But having said that, I can say that in many parts of the world, this is a big business, and they grow corals not only in the sea, but also in ex situ, in aquariums, and they are breeding corals and culturing them for the aquarium trade. So my message to anyone who in Sri Lanka who wants to have aquariums is that first study and really understand that it is not like a freshwater tank. It requires a lot of attention. It requires a lot of equipment, and it's also an expensive activity. So get ready thoroughly and learn about it before you actually try to have marine aquariums. And there is no law to say that you can't have a marine aquarium, but nevertheless, you can't possess corals because corals are protected species under the Fauna and Flora Protection Ordinance. And there may be certain species of fish also protected in both the Fauna and Flora Protection Ordinance as well as the Fisheries Act. So be aware that you are not actually putting yourself on the line and to get arrested by having these specimens. Whether it's dead or alive, those protected species cannot be kept.
Okay, thank you, Arjan. So with that, we have come to the end of this session. I would like to thank our exclusive patron, the EU delegation in Sri Lanka, Summit patron Dilma Conservation, and Keels and supporting patron Plasticycle, and how each and every one of us can help to save the beauty of the coral reefs for future generations. Please do stay tuned for the rest of the summit, as we intend to talk a lot on mangroves and seagrass conservation, which is again a very interesting topic, and it will start at 1:30 p.m. Thank you, Arjan and Nishan, for joining in for today's session. I wish all of you and the expert panelists a very good rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.